Hello, everyone. This is Tom Zaccaro. Welcome to SEC Roundup. With me, as always, is the founder of ICANN, Nick Morgan. Hey, Nick.
Hey, Tom. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you, too. We have a terrific panel today, and we're going to talk about a subject that's near and dear to our hearts that we frequently comment on, and that is transparency in administrative hearings. And in this case, it's going to be PCAOB administrative hearings. And with us, we have four professors who recently wrote an article on this very topic. I'm going to introduce each of you, and then you can give your university affiliations. But let me start with Eldar Maksymov.
Hey, thanks for starting with the most difficult name. So I'm at the Arizona State University. Auditor.
I want to get it out of the way early. Nate Cannon is here. Hi, Nate.
Glad to be here. I'm a professor at Texas State University.
And then we have Professor Noah Myers.
Yeah, I'm at Utah Valley University.
And then Professor Phil Lamoreaux. Hi, Phil.
Hello. Thanks for the invite. I am at Arizona State University.
Terrific. Well, we have a really terrific panel. Let's jump right in. And Nick, why don't you start out with, why is this topic important and why are we talking about it?
Well, of course, we're talking about it because our guests wrote a paper, Is the PCAOB enforcement approach aligned with its mandate? Perspectives of sanctioned auditors and former PCAOB enforcement staff. And their paper really provides some data for some things that we've understood anecdotally. So I think it's important to talk about that in general. The PCAOB, of course, hasn't been around forever. It's been a fairly recent creation. And ever since its creation, it has been somewhat controversial. Even today, there are several court challenges about the PCAOB, its existence, and how it conducts itself. So 2025 is a perfect time for this paper to have come out and for us to be hearing more about the PCAOB. So I'm eager to hear what the professors found in their paper. So let me shift over to you guys, and I'll leave it up to you who answers which question, of course. But let's talk about the Tom highlighted off the bat, transparency and fairness. Your paper highlights some concerns about how the PCAOB conducts its business and whether there's a lack of transparency in the way it does its enforcement. What specific changes in disclosure or public reporting would most improve perceptions of fairness without undermining the enforcement process itself?
I guess I can kick us off, and then everyone else can correct the things that I say. I think when it comes to transparency, right? Let me first off just to kind of set up a broader benchmark. The four of us have all done a fair bit of research on PCAOB broadly, right? And many of us have come to the conclusion that there's many good things that the PCAOB does. Okay, so just as a broader context, there's some improvements, opportunities for the PCAOB enforcement process. Okay, a couple things that from a transparency standpoint that would be beneficial for the observers of the PCAOB is, the enforcement is kind of the last straw, right? For an auditor, that's kind of when the PCAOB has made a decision that they've done something very bad and they're likely out. And so one thing that I think would be very beneficial from a transparency standpoint is, how were investors truly harmed to cause, this auditor to then essentially be out, if that makes sense. So, how are the investors harmed? Did the auditor have, equal opportunity to respond, I would say, to the enforcement process? Because at least in our interviews, it can be very opaque to those that are going through the process. And so do they have an opportunity to respond to the criticisms and then ultimately what happened? And, I can let everybody else comment as well. So, but that would be my initial take. So.
Absolutely. And let me just add to what Phil just beautifully outlined. We are not talking about whether PCAOB, because you mentioned like PCAOB's existence and how they do things. We all are absolutely convinced that PCAOB should exist. It was created for the right purpose. It's doing great things. Even the auditors whom we interviewed, the sanctioned auditors, they do agree PCAOB plays an important role. So we're just talking about fine-tuning of what they're doing and how they go about it and the fairness of this enforcement process. And to Phil's point, one of the key things that we believe needs to happen to improve transparency is for PCAOB enforcement orders to actually be transparent. That is, if you got fined $2 million, why is it $2 million? What is the justification for that compared to somebody who got fined $30,000 for a very similar offense? So auditors themselves need to have an understanding up front what penalties they should be expecting, what the PCAOB matrix, if you will, you do X, you will receive Y as punishment. The SEC does a better job at this, at least internally. They have a manual where their enforcement staff know, here's how we select cases for enforcement, and here's how we determine sanctions. But our respondents are telling us they don't know why are we in $5 million zone versus $2 million zone. We don't know. And most importantly, what that creates is sort of adverse incentives for enforcers then to just punish everybody whom they can get their hands on, because and I'm not saying that that's what they're doing. In fact, our interviewers were very explicit that they work with wonderful people, the PCAOB enforcers themselves. But they essentially have incentives to just report numbers if they don't have to justify how does it harm investors. So we think that that's one of the key things that needs to change. There needs to be a paragraph, investor harm. In every order, if you report that somebody got sanctioned, what was the investor harm? How is the sanction related to investor harm? So that's number one.
I should probably interrupt for a moment and give you a chance to just talk about your article. So the title of the article is, quote, "Is the PCAOB enforcement approach aligned with its mandate? Perspectives of sanctioned auditors and former PCAOB enforcement staff," and it's published in the Contemporary Accounting Research magazine this past February. And maybe Nate or Noah, you can tell us the research you did and the interviews you performed to prepare the article.
Yeah, I can take that one. So yeah, I mean, we came at this from, there's a fair amount of academic research on the inspection process and, is that operating the way it should be? And so that we know a fair amount about that. There's not been very much research on the enforcement piece, which, as Phil mentioned, is kind of the end of the line. Like when someone gets an enforcement order, it has major consequences for their career. So to come at this, we interviewed, we contacted a great number of these people that have been sanctioned, ended up interviewing 20 of them to find some insights, and then to make sure that what we're finding was reliable, to kind of triangulate that. We then interviewed, I believe, 13 former PCAOB employees that used to be in the enforcement division, and largely found consistent results, not just sour apples from the sanctioned auditors, but PCAOB people saying the same thing. And just to kind of set the stage a little bit, we came at this from, what we call, the theory behind it is this procedural justice theory, which essentially says that, hey, look, here's about 6 or 7 elements of a fair process. Was it transparent? Did they feel like they could tell their side of the story? Were the reports accurate and things like that? So we kind of systematically went through and say, okay, are they meeting each of these elements? And if they did, there would be a fair process. And we found that basically all of the different elements have elements that could be improved. There were some things done right, quite a few things that could be improved. So that's kind of the stage of what our paper is doing and looking at.
Now, what did you see as the biggest failings of the PCAOB process?
I guess it's hard to give a rank order of exactly which one, but I think the things we've talked about so far, the thing that sticks out to me is this idea of, we start the paper by saying SOX, the law, says we need to set up this process and it should be fair. The word fairness is in there somewhere, which is why I made it into our title. And all we're trying to point out is, whatever the PCAOB does, we're trying to say there's a gap between what it was supposed to do and what it does. And so the investor protection part that was already mentioned is one that stuck out to us a lot while talking to these sanctioned auditors, because the sanctions are a really big deal. When you have an enforcement action against you, it's to use kind of maybe a tired analogy, it becomes a scarlet letter. Some of our interviewees used that term because if you Google the name of an enforced auditor, an auditor that's gone through an enforcement action, it's the first thing that comes up. So someone looking for work, I'm going to Google them. I Google anyone we're hiring very quickly. And even once that sanction has passed, it's a year, it sometimes isn't even a time frame, it's just a censure. But because it's a government website and the way things are indexed, that still pops up. And so there was just an overall disconnect between what is the PCAOB trying to do, protect investors, and what is the enforcement process actually doing? And so that to me, it still encompasses a lot. I don't know if it's as specific of an answer as you're trying to get at, but I think that the transparency of the process and the focus on investor protection would be the two things that come to my mind.
Tom, let me just add to what Noah just said about scarlet letter. We think it's very important that if the intent is to punish an auditor permanently, then that's being achieved. But we don't believe that that's the intent, because then that affects the market for the smaller companies that then struggle to find good auditors if everybody's out of the market. So our practical solution, and the PCAOB and the tech people that they have such big budget, they can solve that. But it needs to be very clear, even if for whatever reason, maybe there are some legal reasons why once you've been sanctioned, the sanction order needs to appear somewhere. But it also needs to be very explicit, like Noah said, once the sanction has passed, it has passed. So you're done, you're good, you can audit public companies now again, and you're in good standing with PCAOB. That needs to be very clear. Maybe it's a separate rating, some database that PCAOB keeps up, like whether you're in good standing or not. So it's very, very clear that you're good to go.
We see the same thing in SEC investigations and SEC administrative orders. Often there's no clear endpoint where a person would be sort of cleared of that scarlet letter impact. And another thing we see, and so, we're a nonprofit law firm. One of the things we do is provide pro bono legal services to people in SEC related investigations, because it's incredibly resource intensive to try and defend yourself from one of these.
Yes. Yeah.
I think one of the points you all made in your paper was that small firms may be disproportionately targeted. Is that a conclusion that you drew? And what do you think? Is that a byproduct? Is that a feature or a bug?
I would say it's potentially both. I mean, I think, smaller firms have fewer resources to conduct audits, right? And, therefore, perhaps on average, the quality of the work they do is lower, maybe on average effect, right? But so maybe it's partly that, but maybe it's also partly they don't have the resources to protect themselves, right? In many cases, at least in some of the interviews, right? They're mortgaging a house, right, to protect themselves or to mount a legal defense. And then, in some, it seems like in some interviews we had, some of the recommendations were just give up and don't even defend yourself, because at the end of the day, you're going to lose. So, the smaller firms are the ones that are disproportionately disadvantaged in the process, because it's, you guys are attorneys, most attorneys are very, very expensive, right? Particularly for stuff like this. And so I think they are disadvantaged. I think this is also where the evidence, in my mind, evidence of investor harm is so important, right? Many of their clients for these very small audit firms are not going to be widely held, right? They're not going to be in S&P 500 companies, obviously. They're not going to be in your mom's 401k or something like that. And so it's, ownership for these firms is probably pretty narrow. Information for the investors in these firms is probably more, available, right? And so to me, this is where clear evidence of investor harm needs to be made for these small audit firms, because they're the ones that are, if you just look at the volume of cases, right, they're the ones, it's the vast majority of the cases, and you can't hide behind the name of an audit firm at all. So anyway, that's my point. So I think it's kind of both, but there's certainly a disadvantage.
And I agree completely with Phil. And just to color that with some actual numbers that we ran, the biggest club that the PCAOB has is revoking your registration. You're out of the game, right? And so we looked at the 80 or so of those that happened, and looked at, okay, who what clients are they auditing? 97% of those were over the counter stocks. average market, their low market cap, I think, was like 48 million, which is many orders of magnitude lower than even the lowest, market cap of someone in the Russell 2000. I mean, these are, so it's a bit of a disconnect between the public rhetoric of, we have quotes in the paper of like, hey, we're protecting your mom and dad, these mom and pop shops that, that they're investing for college, and who's actually, in there. Right. And so that disconnect was a little concerning.
And
there.
just to give a little more context to that, we only see public clients, right? They can have a whole private industry, which is probably most of their business.
Yeah.
97% of their public clients are over the counter stocks. Only 3% are even, register as kind of the public companies we usually think about.
Right.
And here's an important point about this overall approach that the PCAOB has taken. The perception that both auditors and even the PCAOB enforcement staff have is that it's very punitive. Rather than having a focus on improving the audit quality overall, the expectation is like, well, if we punish enough people, if we scare the, if we scare them, the spit out of them, right? I don't want you to cut the words from podcasts, so I'm deliberately not swearing, but if we scare them enough, right, then somehow audit quality will increase. But there should be a more educational approach. There's been a lot of research done outside of financial regulation on regulation and what approaches work the most. And the big theory that came out that is being very influential and works very well for regulators who adopt it is called the responsive regulation theory. And the very simple premise is that you don't use your big stick right away. You try to work with the auditor and see, maybe the auditor just really doesn't know what they're doing. Is that good? No, it's not good, of course. But let's see if we can help them know what to do. And if they do it again, then we maybe slap them a little more, and then eventually we just take them out. So that's sort of like a progressive approach, responsive approach based on their actions. And what's important to say here is that what we see is that the current PCAOB leadership is much more willing to listen, much more willing to listen to academics, listen to the research that's been done than what we've seen before. We've interacted with the current leadership, and we are very hopeful. If you see, look at what they're already doing there. I think like this weekend, there is going to be some sort of educational event for small auditors. I believe it's in LA, if I'm not mixing it up. But there's constantly something now about educating smaller auditors, whereas before, even a couple of years ago, that was once in the blue moon.
The issues or problems you've identified about, say, the transparency around investor harm and the incentives toward maybe targeting smaller firms, what do you view as, or does your paper propose solutions for some of these problems? What do you think the path forward here is? Is it just, now we've got a change in leadership of the PCAOB and that takes care of it, or does there need to be rulemaking, legislative? What are your thoughts on how to correct these problems?
Yeah, one pretty consistent finding from both the auditors and surprisingly from the PCAOB, former PCAOB enforcement staff was this issue of incentives, right? Where they were pretty clear that to get your raise, to move up, to get the promotion, you put up numbers, right? Which feeds into all of our previous conversations we've had here. If you know that you need a number and you see a big auditor with a big budget, an army of attorneys versus a small guy that can't mount to 7-figure defense and $1,500 an hour audit fee or attorney fees, and to be clear, we also found that like these are good people. They all said, hey, we're working with good people, but we know that even good people respond to incentives, right? And this is not an easy problem to fix, and it's not unique to the PCAOB, of course, but to the extent that you can change the incentive structure so that it's not just, hey, how many notches on your belt do you have? But did you follow a fair procedure, right? If you put 100 hours into investigating this and you find out that they don't deserve to be sanctioned and you back off, you shouldn't be punished for that, right? You should somehow be rewarded. Now, I don't know the exact mechanism for that to happen, but I think that's key to all the things we're talking about here. Is just
very important point, and I just need to add this. So the mechanism, of course, is to change culture. Hey, why don't you be a better guy or a girl and actually focus on investor harm? But the key mechanism that we could think of is the requirement needs to be made for every sanction order to have an investor harm paragraph. If I, as an attorney, and by the way, I interview attorneys, we absolutely have respect for what attorneys do. It's super important. But incentives speak, right? If my incentive as an attorney is to just report numbers, I'm going to go after small firms who can defend themselves, after easy violations. Like, I think there's like Form 3 violation is one of the most popular on the list of, because they're very easily, it's an administrative violation, boom, done. My statistic is done for the month, I earn my pay. But if I have to justify what's the investor harm, I would look very foolish if I have, try to explain how Form 3, some small violation, harms investor. And so that is an automatic, most important mechanism that we see that would affect incentives. And then, of course, to Nate's point, it would be hard to eventually just change culture, but that one thing we believe will do the biggest changes that we need to see.
And it's not even that, you can't have a sanction against someone for small infractions. That can exist, right? We can give speeding tickets for going 5 over. There's enforcement discretion there, but what we see is it's not commensurate with the scarlet letter of essentially not being able to practice your profession anymore for a procedural issue. And that's where we see this disconnect again that we started from at the top of the paper.
Right.
And let me just, since we're wrapping up and I know we're out of time, but
Please.
just very quickly, other very specific things we see, there needs to be some sort of rubric. If you do X, you will get Y, at least internally. And we debated among our co-author team, should it be public or not? But eventually, all internal things become public. There needs to be some sort of, if you speed over 15 miles, you get this much fine. That will improve transparency. Require investor harm rationale. We already talked about that. That's key. That will change incentives. Improve correctability procedures. If your sanction is over, it needs to be very clearly seen. And the last one we didn't touch upon, but I'll just mention this, appellate reform. Based on our research, there's not a single case, but that's what we heard from enforcement staff. There has not been a single case where appeal was overturned, auditor appeal was overturned against the PCAOB. That has never happened. So the appeal process does not work. It needs to become more independent. So there's some independent sort of review in the appeal cases, and that will require potential legislation change.
Well, I think those are great points. On the staff incentive point, if you figure out a mechanism, and I heard, obviously stating investor harm, that would be a great, articulating that as you're going through the internal process of getting a matter approved would be a huge start. Tom and I know from our work in the enforcement division, the division suffers from that same problem. If an Enron-sized case approved, you get the same amount of credit as if you get some little, street offering non-fraud violation approved. At the time we were at the commission, one of my supervisors was a big fan of the TV show The Wire, which depicts police in Baltimore battling drugs. And they make the exact same point. And she was often fond of saying, look, guys, let's spend our time on cases that matter. And so at least informally in that section, it was important to be able to, talk about investor harm. We ended up doing a lot of Ponzi scheme cases. So I think your sides are spot on, and we wish you great success in persuading others to bring about change.
And maybe I'll jump in with one quick point here that comes up. So we talked about staff incentives at the individual level.
Yes.
But I think it's worth making a point too that at a more global level, at the PCAOB as a whole, and that's in some ways the staff incentives make sense because there's, as an institution, some strong incentives. And, we saw Chair Williams a lot out there kind of chest thumping like, hey, record number of fines and, kind of always bragging about what's being done, which is uncomfortable to hear knowing our research, but also understandable given, like this summer we saw the PCAOB just about disappear, and we see senators coming at them with, hey, you're not doing enough. And so they have a strong incentive as an institution as a whole to put up the numbers as well. And so that's something that they can't even necessarily fix internally because they're getting that pressure, and like individuals, they respond to that pressure by doing what they think they need to do to survive, which is,
that's a good point. But we do believe they're very important, and all we want is them to be fine-tuned. We think they play a very important role for investors. Thank you so much, gentlemen. We believe what you're doing is very important, and let us know if we can help again in the future.
Thank you all for joining us. It was a very illuminating discussion.
Everybody else, please join us on the next SEC Roundup. If you want information about ICANN, go to icanlaw.org. We'll see you next time.